What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and if you're enjoying the content here on my channel, then make sure you hit the like button and make sure you hit subscribe so you can help decide what direction the content on my channel goes in the foreseeable future. Okay, so we are jumping into our X-Men chronology, and I'm not sure what day I'm going to upload this on, but whatever day it ends up being will probably just be our X-Men day. X-Men, I've been reading forever. I mean, it's the first, one of the very first comics that really got me into comic books per se. The first comic I ever owned was Sovereign 7 and something by Batman, although I cannot remember what in the world it was. There's an old Batman comic, and I cannot remember what it was, but the villain was like this guy that wore all black, and he had like sharp claws, it looked like, and like he tried to drown Batman in like the sewers, I think. Maybe it was after Nightfall. I'm not 100% sure. I mean, I'm pretty sure it was, but I don't remember if it was Bruce Wayne Batman or if it was like John Paul Valley Batman. But I cannot remember for the life of me, but it was just a Batman comic. And I know it's a needle in a haystack considering we've got 900 some odd detective comics and God only knows how many hundreds of Batman comics, but I've been trying to figure out what in the world that is. And I've been trying to figure it out forever. So if anybody knows, if just on that little description alone, you have an idea of what I'm referencing, post it down in the comments. I will be checking. So hopefully somebody has it. But when it comes to the X-Men, it's interesting because the X-Men have existed in Marvel Comics for decades. The problem with this was that with Chris Claremont writing the X-Men for 17 years, after he left, after Jim Lee left as artist in the early 90s, the X-Men just sort of began to falter because nobody was really able to bring the kind of character development to the X-Men comics that Chris Claremont was able to do. This was compounded by the mid-1990s comic bust, and we don't need to go into that. Suffice it to say, it was a point whereby Marvel almost went bankrupt. And so by the early 2000s, Marvel was basically reshuffling everything. And the result was that we got something called X-Men Reload. Now, X-Men Reload was this mid-2000s initiative that was really kind of this idea of just reshuffling the whole X-Men mythos and then just kind of boiling it down to its core roots. Because over the course of the 17 years Chris Claremont wrote the X-Men, over the course of the subsequent years that other writers like Scott Lobdell and, Grant Morrison and so on and so forth wrote the X-Men, the issue was you would get mutants who would be rolled into a story, they would appear once and they would never be seen or heard from again. And the problem that Marvel faced was that the number of mutants out there had just grown too high. And so because of that, X-Men Reload was designed to literally reduce the number of mutants down to the most popular characters. That's why we got the event called House of M. It was designed to basically eliminate so many mutants that were there and just boil it down to its core roots. And so following the events of House of M, we got this sort of branding initiative called Decimation. And so with Uncanny X-Men, what this does is this picks up with the fall of the Greys. Now remember, with our X-Men days, we're covering almost everything. So you guys will basically find out what all was happening on like the X-Men universe side of things in Marvel Comics. We've done it with almost everybody else to this point. I mean, we're in the process of doing it with Avengers and New Avengers. We've done it with Captain America. We've done it with Iron Man. We've done it with Spider-Man. Because of that, with Death of the Greys, this is designed to actually wrap up in a lot of ways the character of Rachel Summers. Not in the sense that it's going to kill her off, but in the sense that it's basically sort of allowing her to quote unquote start anew. Now, under normal circumstances, I probably wouldn't have covered this, but Rachel Summers is going to have a pretty significant role once we get to the story of X-Men Deadly Genesis, which basically brings back the character of Vulcan, which is the third Summers brother who's an Omega level mutant, but Rachel Summers will be the means by which he basically learns everything that's going on. But with Rachel Summers, she's really intriguing. So in Marvel Comics, as most of you guys probably know, they had a story called X-Men Days of Future Past. And X-Men Days of Future Past, at the time that it was written, was basically a worst case scenario, right? It was the answer to the question, what if the X-Men failed? What if Charles Xavier, Moira McTaggart, the mutant geneticist, and what if a political figure, Senator Robert Kelly, were all taken out by the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants? What would humanity's response to that be? Well, of course, as we know from the story, humanity responded by restarting the Sentinel program. The Sentinels became autonomous. They conquered the entirety of North America, humans and mutants alike, and set their sights on the world. And so the story was kind of a race against time because it was the idea that the various European nations had effectively bonded under one goal of eliminating the Sentinel threat from North America so it wouldn't infect anything else. And so they were basically launching nuclear weapons at the US. The result is that Canada, the United States, all these different territories were at risk of being totally obliterated. And so you basically had the efforts of a handful of mutants who had survived and were living in internment camps that were trying to keep this from happening. Rachel Summers is one of them. Now, the way in which this timeline fits in is a little bit weird, so bear with me here for a second. In Marvel Comics, when you see a story that takes place in the future, for the most part, that's the guaranteed future. Usually the story involves somebody going back and changing things. The Days of Future Past was a story where the Sentinels have conquered North America. And so the question had to be asked, if that was a future where Sentinels conquered North America and they were trying to stop that future, then what happens to it when they succeed? To that universe where the Sentinels conquered North America, it becomes an alternate reality, is exactly what it does. And so essentially, with Kitty Pryde's mind being sent into the past, warning the X-Men what was going to happen, and ultimately saving the day, it meant that Days of Future Past future became an alternate reality. The future was unwritten. We had no indication of what the future was going to be until somebody came along and wrote a story that involved the future. In the Days of Future Past reality, Jean Grey and Cyclops had a child, and that child's name was Rachel Summers. But Rachel Summers, like her mom, was a telepath and telekinetic, and that was it. That was really all there was to her character initially. But she was the one who sent the mind of Kitty Pryde into the past and warned the X-Men that Days of Future Past would happen and what would start that whole process. The problem with this was that because it became an alternate reality, the future was basically unchanged in that universe. Days of Future Past progressed just like it did. The long and short of this is that because Rachel Summers basically looked around and realized the future didn't change, the question was why? Why is her world still the same? And so what ended up happening is Marvel wrote a story called Days of Future Present. And what that was designed to do was roll Rachel Summers into the main Marvel universe. And so what she ended up doing was in truth, basically jumping from her own universe into the main Marvel universe and into the past of the main Marvel universe. And so the result was that we basically got this new character who was the daughter of Jean Grey. Now, all of this came out of the death of Jean, came out of the Phoenix Saga, the Dark Phoenix Saga, so on and so forth. So Jean Grey had been dead for quite some time. You know, she had been gone for a little while, and then of course she ended up coming back as we all know. But the idea of bringing Rachel into the fray, and really kind of brought in a new dynamic. And it was really interesting. Following Chris Claremont leaving the title, she just sort of bounced around from one story to the next, and nobody ever really fleshed her out. There were a couple times when she went to go visit the home of Jean Grey, but she never really tried to bond with the family or anything along those lines. And so following the events of House of M, because of the fact that Rachel Summers was basically in the white hot room, which is to say this sort of multiversal space, meaning that when House of M happened and all the mutants lost their powers, she was unaffected. When she showed back up in the main Marvel universe, she realized everything had just sort of gone to pot. And so what this did is it kind of centered on an existential crisis because, with her being a mutant and so many mutants having lost their powers and her having been, one of the few who retained her own, that it really kind of, inspired this desire to travel back and visit her family. Now remember, this is not Rachel's real family, and I say that because of the fact that she's from a different universe. She's the daughter of Jean Grey and Scott Summers from an alternate reality. But the bonding process happens almost immediately. I mean, basically she kind of shows back up, she starts talking to everybody, and this had been something that had been a long time in coming. I mean, she'd met them like once or twice, but they knew who she was. I mean, in terms of her being the daughter of Jean and Scott, from a different universe and so on and so forth. But it was cool because this bonding basically gives her a home that she never experienced before. Because one of the things about Rachel is that because she was universally displaced, it meant that she didn't really have a home of her own. But for her, it wasn't that bad because the home she came from was awful. But the cool thing is that with her bonding with everybody, learning about her own past, talking to various people, one of the other people that she comes into contact with is basically her grandma. And the irony of all this is that her grandma doesn't like Rachel. She hates Rachel in every sense of the word. But a lot of this really stems back to, this woman and her husband giving up Jean Grey to Charles Xavier. Now remember, at the time when Jean first started to manifest her powers, it was one of those things where no parent really knew what to do because Jean Grey was one of the first of a handful of mutants that publicly began to display powers. So it's not like her parents had a template. It's not like they knew where to go. Charles Xavier popping up and basically saying, I run a school for gifted children, for people that have abilities like your daughters. I can help your daughter cope with her powers, so on and so forth. It was a welcoming thing. The problem with this was that Jean Grey's experience, as a lot of us know as part of the X-Men, was tumultuous. She was the weakest member of the team. She eventually was catapulted to the strongest member of the team. She was a harbinger or a possessor of the Phoenix Force. She died. She was resurrected. She died again. She was resurrected and then finally died. I mean, a lot of these things started taking place with her character bouncing around and all these sort of scenarios happening. But at the end of the day, her parents were largely left in the dark. They weren't really told everything that was going on. Instead, they would just see their daughter on TV fighting crime. They would learn that their daughter had died. And so it created a really strange sort of scenario. Rachel Summers being there basically reminds the parents of Jean Grey of all the things they missed out on and the idea that it may very well have been a mistake to allow Jean to go with Charles Xavier. So again, she's very much a reminder of the mistakes they feel they've made. And so ultimately what ends up happening is there's this massive family reunion that takes place. And it's cool because Rachel gets to meet all these members of her extended family that she never knew about before. The problem with this is that almost immediately after this family, begins to have their whole get together, people start dying rapidly. And it all happens within the span of 24 seconds. From right now until I say that we've moved on, everything that we talk about happens in the span of 24 seconds. First member of the family dies, John Gray. Following that, we end up having Fred Harriman. He ends up dying too. All these members are killed from being impaled. They're killed from having all these assassins start jumping in out of nowhere, and they all start dying. We have Nightcrawler, who immediately teleports in alongside a handful of other X-Men, getting people out as best they can. And the reason for this is because of the fact that when Rachel Summers immediately starts realizing that people are dying, she sends out a kind of psychic backlash. Now, this is kind of a side effect, so to speak, for lack of a better word, of her being in the situation that she's in. Remember, Rachel Summers, having lived in Days of Future Past, hardened her in a lot of different ways. She was combat trained, combat focused. And so in this scenario, when you suddenly have all these Greys dying, that so far happened in the span of 8 seconds, Rachel panics. This massive psychic backlash that goes out hits Emma Frost first. Emma Frost immediately picks up what's happening, alerts the X-Men, Nightcrawler teleports in. All that happens in the span of 8 seconds. And so it's crazy because these assassins take no prisoners. They're there for one goal, and that goal is to take out every single member of the Grey family they can find. This is a very powerful and a very capable group. And the reason why is because this group is part of the Shi'ar Empire. They're basically an elite squad of assassins. They were sent here for the purpose of eliminating what was left of the Summers line. Now remember, Rachel is not a weakling. She's not a person easily taken out. And by all standards of measurement, by this, Shi'ar assassin group, they can't really kill her. She's still in possession of the Phoenix Force to a degree. And the result is that she can't be killed through traditional means. Instead, what they do is they effectively brand her. And what this means is they'll be able to find her anywhere in the universe, no matter where she goes. Now, the other half of this is that because this is a Shi'ar elite guard, this allows us to sort of bring in a discussion about the Shi'ar Empire. Now, in Marvel Comics, you got a lot of different empires that exist out there. Humanity is just a bunch of folks who live on Earth, and there's some really powerful people, but that's it. We reside on one planet. Most people don't even know about the various alien races that are out there. And so the Shi'ar Empire is a massive empire. It basically spans almost the entirety of its galaxy, consisting of thousands and thousands of worlds, but they are an amalgamation of races. Unlike the Skrulls, which is basically the Skrull Empire, and they're all Skrulls. The Shi'ar is a variety of different races who have all sworn fealty to the Magistrix or the Magister, whoever it is that's running the show at the time. But this assassin group going through is designed for one purpose: to take out these various people. Now, the X-Men are a threat, but at the end of the day, they're not necessarily indefeatable by this group. And in fact, because of the fact that the X-Men have faced off against the Shi'ar Empire at different points over the course of their publication history, what this means is that the Shi'ar does have a pretty solid understanding of how to get into Earth, deal with the various superheroes who are there, how to avoid them if at all possible, how to get their target, and how to leave without being seen. The problem is they didn't really bank on Rachel Summers being there, and that was the cog in the wheel, broke the whole scenario wide open. The other half of this is that the grandmother of Rachel Summers, the mother of Jean Grey, despises her existence. And this is one of the crazy scenarios because her mother is basically grieving. Within the span of 24 seconds, which, we've basically ended this 24 seconds, every single member of her family has been totally obliterated. They've been totally wiped out, destroyed in a multitude of different ways. It happened so fast that half the people who were there didn't even know what was happening before they died. The whole idea of Elaine looking around and saying, everything I know and love is gone, and it's because of you. She blames Rachel. The cool thing about this is her blame is not necessarily misplaced. While Jean Grey was the Phoenix Force, and while Jean Grey had died following the battle between the X-Men and the Shi'ar Imperial Guard during the original, Phoenix and Dark Phoenix sagas, what this meant was that the Shi'ar Empire was largely hands-off. The problem with this was that when Rachel Summers appeared and then basically wielded the Phoenix Force for the first time, what it meant is that the Phoenix can not only be possessed by Jean Grey, it can be possessed by the bloodline of Jean Grey. And that presented a whole new credible threat, because when the Shi'ar Empire looks at the Phoenix Force and sees it as a harbinger of the end of all things, meaning when the Phoenix Force, if it loses its mind, it'll destroy all that is, the Shi'ar Empire is operating in the preservation of the universe. But if Rachel Grey can have the Phoenix Force, Rachel Grey's child can have the Phoenix Force, and her grandchild can have the Phoenix Force, and so on and so forth. And so even if Jean Grey was able to maintain control to a degree, even if Jean Grey was a benign host for the Phoenix Force, even if Rachel hasn't necessarily displayed herself as an overt villain with the Phoenix Force, it does not mean that a grandchild or a great-grandchild or some some descendant later on down the line would basically use the power of the Phoenix to destroy everything in the universe. And so this is an act of preservation by the Shi'ar Empire. It's not an act of aggression in the sense of being rooted in malice. And so because of this, the anger of Elaine is not misplaced. Rachel Summers is a good person. She is a hero, but she's the cause of all this. Whether it was her intention or not is irrelevant. The fact is, her actions brought this down on everyone. Now, of course, with the rest of the X-Men showing up, the battle's a foregone conclusion. There's no possible way for this Shi'ar assassin group to possibly succeed. It's not going to happen. As a result, the Shi'ar assassins group basically bails out and they essentially just take off. And so what ends up happening here is it's really just sort of this bonding moment between Rachel and Scott Summers. When it came to Rachel and when it came to Cyclops, their bonding was strong insofar as they were more friends as opposed to father and daughter. And it's been that way with the offspring of Cyclops and Jean in a lot of different ways. Cable, who was time displaced and came back to the present day, the relationship between the two was very strenuous at first. It was really one of those things where Cable was more like, look, your emotional attachment is a distraction and I've got a mission to fulfill, so I'll catch you later. While you did know they were father and son, albeit Cable looking vastly older than his biological dad, they didn't really bond as a father and son normally did. It took quite some time in Marvel Comics before that was fleshed out, but it was interesting because with the character of Rachel, she never really bonded on the same level. I mean, she did to a degree, but it was really one of those things where it was hard for her and Jean Grey to bond together. It was hard for her and Cyclops to bond together because Rachel represented a future where they died and everything had failed. She represented the worst case scenario for everything the X-Men did as basically all for nothing. And so it's sort of interesting. The problem with this is the story sort of putters out. It sort of ends in a lackluster way in the sense that Jean Grey basically takes her family into the white hot room, the afterlife, more or less. That's really kind of it. The reason why I say this is kind of lackluster is because, I mean, with the white hot room, it's weird. So, okay, here's one thing I want to flesh out in this video. I want to talk about this for a second. I want to talk about the afterlife in Marvel Comics. Marvel has depicted the afterlife in a variety of different ways. Where does an average person go when they die in the Marvel universe? So originally, you just had Hela in Marvel Comics. And I know this has almost nothing to do with the X-Men, but bear with me for a second. Originally, you just had Hela. And when the old Stan Lee, Jack Kirby stories were detailing, tales of Asgard and, all that Asgardian mythos, basically anybody who died went to the realm of Hela. And that was it. Those individuals who died in battle, they went to Valhalla. When Mistress Death came along, then it was basically an argument of, okay, we have to split the difference and we have to find a way to reconcile the two. So what Marvel said is you have the realm of Mistress Death and you have the realm of Hela. Hela takes the souls of those individuals who believe in Asgard but did not die an honorable death. Those individuals who believe in Asgard and did die an honorable death in battle, presumably, they'll go to Valhalla. Everybody else goes to the realm of Mistress Death, and that's it. Well, then you had Chris Claremont come along and he started writing the X-Men. Jean Grey becomes the Phoenix and she learns about the white hot room, which is depicted as one of the various iterations of death. And so then that question becomes, how does that reconcile into everything? Now, if I remember correctly, Jean Grey met with a guy when she was in the afterlife, and that guy, I think, was an aspect of Mistress Death. And it was basically Mistress Death saying that when people are in the afterlife, how they perceive that afterlife is contextual based on the life they live. So not everybody goes to like heaven. Not everybody goes to like hell or someplace like that. But then again, you also have all those realms that exist out there. You've got the realm of Mephisto, basically this demon entity who takes the souls of those he tricks. You've got a heaven in Marvel Comics. You've got an actual hell in Marvel Comics. There really hasn't been this sort of consolidation in Marvel about how all those things intertwine and how all those things reconcile with one another. And so the White Hot Room is just kind of this place where the Phoenix goes to do its work. And that's really it. That was the explanation that was given by Grant Morrison. That was the explanation that was continued by Greg Pak during Phoenix Endsong. But the general gist of this, from what I've been able to grasp when it comes to the White Hot Room, is that Jean Grey is basically able to take those individuals and sort of usher them to the afterlife. This is the only instance that I believe I've ever seen Jean Grey lead anybody to the afterlife, but it does bring that into the equation and it does say it's possible. But it is kind of interesting because it does bring a lot of these things into fray. And so ultimately what ends up happening is that with her entire family being totally eradicated by this assassin group from the Shi'ar Empire, what ends up happening here is Rachel Summers basically swears revenge. And so what this is going to do is lead directly into the events of Deadly Genesis. It's going to lead into the events of Rachel Summers coming across Vulcan. Vulcan basically waking up and then her meeting an Omega level mutant so powerful that he can overwhelm and overpower Rachel Summers even with the power of the Phoenix Force. But with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this video to an end. If you are new here to Comments Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoy this video, make sure you drop a like and I will catch you all later. Peace.